Hi guys, welcome to another episode of Movement Monday. Today I'm going to be talking about why foam rolling and static stretching might not be working for your mobility. Now this is something that I've personally experienced. I remember doing my masters and I would literally be the guy with cricket balls in my bag, foam rolling in between lectures on the floor, and to be honest, I wasn't really seeing that much improvement. And in today's Movement Monday, I'm going to discuss why that might have been. So firstly, what is banded distraction and what can it do? So banded distraction is a fancy word for saying that you are performing joint mobilizations with movement. Typically involves a band because you are putting a joint back into alignment. So if you've ever found yourself in that position like I did, that you were stretching all the time, foam rolling all the time, and the mobility wasn't sticking around, maybe the joint was never in the right place to start off with. So in the picture, you can see me performing a lateral hip distraction. So this is a fancy word for saying if we've got our ball and socket joint, so we've got our ball and socket joint and our femur. If, for example, we're sat down all day, then this femur can get pulled slightly out of the socket. By having a heavy band on, we can almost pull this head of the femur back into the ball and socket joint. So what you're going to experience if your joint, for example, your femur is sliding out of your hip capsule slightly, or at least not where it should be, is it feels like a pinching or almost like a blocked sensation. So I've had this before where I'll warm up for my squats and I can still squat after grass, no problem, but it almost feels like things are rubbing against each other. So typically this is the femur rubbing against the back of the ball and socket joint, and it just needs that distraction to get it where it needs to be. So the reason why foam rolling and static stretching is ineffective for joints that are out of position is if we take, for example, your pelvis, so imagine a bowl of water, and let's say you're one of these people who stretches their hamstrings all the time, but if your pelvis is anteriorly tilted, so let's say, if I show you from the side here, let's say your pelvis is tilted backwards, what this does is it's already lengthened your hamstrings. Now you're performing static stretching to lengthen a muscle that is already lengthened. You do not need, in this scenario, more length in your hamstrings. What you do need is strength to be able to control that range of motion that you already have. So for example, if I just stand up here, if my pelvis is arched backwards, now all of a sudden you can see my low back, well, it's already killing me, but my hamstrings are lengthened, my hip flexors at the front are shortened, and now when I'm stretching my hamstrings, I'm probably not going to be stretching the right muscles. Whereas if I can use a band or I can tweak this alignment, now I can start stretching and foam rolling the muscles at the right muscle lengths. So how do we do banded distraction? Firstly, we need a heavy band. You're trying to physically pull that hip joint back into the ball and socket. So it's no use messing around with these thin little mini bands that are all over Instagram. You need something thick and strong, and I'll put a link to the one that I use in the description box down below. So you need a heavy band. It needs to pull back to where it's come from. So for example, if this is my hip joint in the ball and socket, then I need that band to pull me back where it needs to be. So if I'm distracting the hip laterally, as you can see in this picture, then I'm pulling away from that pinching sensation. And this is my little mobility method, because a lot of times mobility is almost sold or marketed in such a way that if you're not doing it, you are a bad person, and you do not know what you're doing. But there's reasons for and against mobility. If you watch me train now, my mobility looks a lot different to what it did a few years ago. So firstly, do you feel a pinching? If you feel a pinching type of sensation or a blocked sensation, then the first thing you need to do is get the joint back into place where it needs to be. So if you feel pinching, use some type of banded distraction work. Now let's talk about whether you perceive there to be tightness. I use the word perceive because oftentimes when we're foam rolling and we're static stretching, the reason why this does make us feel better is because it reduces that perception of tightness. Static stretching increases our tolerance to a stretch. It doesn't actually physically change anything structurally within the muscle, it just changes our perception of it. Now, if you were under full anesthetic, chances are you could be put into full splits, no problem, because the brain is no longer receiving feedback in order to tighten up muscles to stop you from hurting yourself. So yes, foam roll if you want to, static stretch if you want to. Around 20 seconds of foam rolling has been shown that it's not statistically different to doing 5 minutes. So 20 seconds of foam rolling in between dynamic movements is going to be a much better, more effective use of time than say 20 minutes of foam rolling at the start of a session. Likewise, static stretching, I'm sure you've probably seen the recent-ish literature that says if you static stretch, you're going to reduce power output. But the thing was, they tested people in an unrealistic scenario. What they did was they had them perform a static stretch and then had them go straight into a vertical jump. Now, let's be honest, if you do use static stretching in your training, chances are you don't go straight from a static movement into a highly explosive one. You might do some static stretching to make you feel good, and then you'll start moving dynamically and getting yourself warm. If there's some dynamic work in between your static work and your explosive movements, you will mitigate or lessen the detrimental effects of static stretching. And finally, are you physically warm? I know this sounds like a stupid question to ask when we're talking about warm-ups, but the amount of times I see people and they've, for example, I don't know, done their foam rolling, they're like, yep, that'll do. And I'm like, you've not increased muscle temperature. So once you've done all these things, once you've got the joint in the right place, once you've reduced any perceptions of tightness, then you need to actually physically get moving. Sounds crazy, I know. So my final thoughts on mobility. Is it pinching? If it is, banded distraction. If it feels tight, then inhibiting overactive muscles is, whether it's through foam rolling or static stretching, is going to be useful for reducing that perception of tightness. In terms of feeling fired up, mini band exercises do work well if you feel like it makes your glutes feel more switched on, then great, more power to you, do that. But finally, get moving. So integrate all of those short-term increases in range of motion, those underactive muscles which have been switched on and brought to the party, then put them into a specific movement. So for example, if it's a lower body day, you've, I don't know, distracted your hip, you've foam rolled your calves and static stretched because that makes you feel good, then do something like a goblet squat or an empty squat with a barbell. So now you are integrating all of those improvements that you've got into your key movement for the day. Equally with these integration movements, this is where you are locking in those short-term improvements in mobility. So for example, if you are to do something like a goblet squat, that's where you're telling your brain, you know what, being in this deep hip range of motion is okay. There's no need to freak out. I feel safe, I feel comfortable, because you are actively controlling that movement. Now, if we compare that to, for example, laying on the floor and bringing one leg up with a band, that's passive. You are not really in control of that situation, so your brain still senses that there might be a need to tighten things up there just so that you don't hurt yourself. Active range of motion, where you are using some kind of load, is going to teach your body that this movement is safe, and it's one of the reasons why when it comes to, for example, deadlifting, I will just chuck weight on the bar as my warm-up and go from there, because I don't feel a pinch. My hamstrings already feel long and strong enough from performing RDLs for many years over a strict range of motion. I can just get straight into integrating those movements into my warm-up. If you feel you need more advice or more specific advice on your mobility, then feel free to drop me a message. I'll link Instagram, Facebook, and below. And if this video has helped, feel free to hit the subscribe button, or if it hasn't helped, please leave me any useful feedback. Thank you for your time. Another Movement Monday. I'm Todd Davidson, P2P Coaching.